What do you know about politics? What should you know? Forget views, beliefs, and opinions. Politics is really a science, and that's where we come in. Welcome to Inside Political Science. I'm Kirby Goodell.
I'm Todd Kent, and we're your guides to what's actually happening in politics. We're using our years of experience to navigate political data, media, money, behavior, and more to educate and inform you. Well, welcome to episode 7 of Inside Political Science. I'm back. Kirby's gone. He's with some students in South Korea. Well, we'll probably hear about that when he comes back. But it's going to be a really interesting show today. I've got a guest host with me today, Dr. Jim Rogers, who is a colleague from the Political Science Department at Texas A&M. Jim is a political scientist by trade, but also uniquely has a law degree, teaches our constitutional law and jurisprudence classes, and he's uniquely able to kind of speak to what our topic today. So just to give you, for those of you who are new, I'm Todd Kent, and I also teach at the Texas A&M University Department of Political Science. And the purpose of this show is to really kind of give an insider's look through the eyes of political science and what's happening in politics, specifically right now, campaigns, and what's happening in our election system. And so I think that today's topic is going to be more and more important as we move forward. I just returned from Europe, and which was interesting because they're having their own set of campaigns, and it was crazy over there. As country after country, we see a kind of a move, they call it populist move or far right move. It's very interesting. What do you, Dr. Rogers? What do you think do you think we're going to see something like that here in the United States?
Well, I think we're already seeing that. I mean, I think that Trump's initial election, or even before that, there's always a fairly substantial vote. This is the Pat Buchanan, even going back to the Know Nothing Party that preceded the Republicans in the 1850s. It was an anti-immigrant party, anti-Catholic, et cetera. And so there's always been this vote, and the question is just the size of it.
You know, I kept asking when I was in Europe, we met with political leaders, I kept asking, is this a response to government overreach? Where government trying to move the nations in Europe a direction faster than the people were ready to go. And it was interesting. Nobody really wanted to answer that question, whether that was the reason. A lot of them pointed to immigration, that immigration was a problem that they've struggled with, just massive number of people coming into the country. And this vote they believe is a backlash against that policy.
Well, I might go a little bit further than that. I don't know that it's a response to government overreach, because the distinction between sort of today's conservative populism and more traditional conservatism is there's at least among those who are writing books, Vance and so forth, Senator Vance and others, a desire for the government to do more intervention along particular dimensions. So I would restyle it and say it's a response to elite overreach. That is, that elite decision makers, not only in the U.S. but in Europe as well, were adopting and implementing policies that for decades many voters didn't appreciate, and we're seeing a response to that.
You know, if you look back in the history of kind of elections and when Europe votes and then the vote later in the United States, a lot of times they kind of mirror each other. So you see the same things happening. I think back to Margaret Thatcher being elected, and then on the heels of that, we elected Ronald Reagan. So it seemed like it was kind of a conservative wave at the time. So it'll be interesting to see as we watch through the summer and the fall what happens in Europe and also what happens here in the U.S. Well, that's not our topic for today. Our topic for today is we're going to discuss the courts. The courts have made lots of decisions over the last year or so. We see lots of things happening, a lot of discussion about it, and we're going to try to determine what is the impact of the courts on our upcoming election.
Hey everyone, I'm Jay Sokol, and I host Brazos Matters, conversations about things you might not know, but should if you live in Aggieland.
And I'm going to get the opportunity to talk again to meteorologists and to journalists and to trusted messengers across the country, across the globe, and I'm here to help. I want us all to talk better and understand things better, and for my kids, for your kids, and their kids, and everybody after that.
All Brazos Matters episodes are on our website and your favorite podcast platforms. Thanks for listening to Aggieland's Public Radio, KAMU.
Next time on The Great American Recipe.
We're inviting you to the second annual Great American Recipe Bake Sale.
Here we go. I have participated in many bake sales.
Be careful with all those crumbs that's around the side.
I have no idea how this is going to turn out.
It's really all about that bake.
Let's go, guys.
I am nervous about these cakes.
I've just never had anything like this.
I can eat 5 of them, you know?
Well, we're going to talk about the Supreme Court and the courts and how they affect elections. I know, growing up, looking back, we always heard this idea that, we're going to elect a president who's going to have the opportunity to nominate people for the Supreme Court and even all our courts across the country. So I always wondered, does it really matter? Is that something that we use in campaigning, or does that move votes?
Well, there's a little bit of evidence recently. We're sort of curious about earlier periods as well, but we just don't have good data on that. That up to now, and I would say since the data is based on earlier periods, that it's not characterizing response to the current court, but the political science data indicate that that Republicans, particularly conservative Republicans, were attentive to the court and voted on an expectation that the president that they would elect would appoint right-thinking or conservative or more conservative justices to change some of the outcomes. The data didn't indicate that liberals were engaged in the same phenomenon. My suspicion is that it was a question of who wanted the court to change. At least since the 1960s, with the development of the Warren Court. I remember when I was just a little kid. I'm not sure I knew what the words meant, but in driving around Los Angeles on bus stop seats, there was impeach Earl Warren advertisements in Orange County, which was an area where there were lots of conservatives. And so for decades, conservatives have been talking about a desire to change the court, whereas liberals felt that it was their court. Now, today, since with Trump appointees in particular, and a seeming 6-3 conservative majority, with important precedents being overturned in abortion, in the Chevron deference, administrative deference, and other things. It could be that liberals will now become similarly activated and start voting on the basis of the court. But it's been pretty mixed, despite the important role that the court plays. There wasn't a huge amount of evidence that it really affects elections all that much.
Is it one of those things that, I think an article came out, maybe it was a PBS poll, said that people thought that the courts were not impartial. They were making decisions based on ideology. And so if you disagreed with that, it's probably because they were making decisions you didn't like. And so is it really, I like the courts if they do what I want them to, and I don't like them if they don't?
Well, so this is one area where political science was perhaps decades in advance of popular opinion, and perhaps even more cynically so than the data indicate. But nonetheless, there's something called the attitudinal model that two political scientists by the name of Spaeth and Siegel developed several decades ago, where Supreme Court decisions or votes by Supreme Court justices aligned with their proxies for what the justices' ideology was. And so in political science for decades now, it hasn't been a question of whether or not politics affects judicial voting. The question is how much and in what ways. And so in some ways, this is an example of public opinion perhaps catching up with where political science had pointed to for a fairly long time now.
So this idea that the courts are political, and you know, I think growing up when we took our political science classes, we're told that, you know, the courts, the Constitution created the courts in a way that they should be impartial. They not impartial. They should not be subject to the whims of politics. So, do we just throw that out? Is that?
Well, this is where I think that the political science, the interpretation of the data needs to be tweaked a little bit, because there are sort of hardcore attitudinal model believers who think that it's all just politics, if I could put it that way, that judges are nothing but legislators in robes. Some of the more recent studies show that it's more subtle than that. And if you talk to any judges, either liberal or conservative, they'll tell you that they don't think of just implementing sort of straight ideology in their votes. Now, I mean, there could be a little bit of rhetorical legerdemain there, but I suspect most of them are telling the truth. Now, what I think the intervening step is right, in our separation of power system, politicians appoint judges. And so presidents and senators who confirm, they look for judges who have judicial philosophies that map onto the political outcomes that they prefer. And so necessarily what they'll do, they'll sort of scope the set of possible nominees, and those who will provide what in their opinions are the right decisions, those who have the judicial philosophy, they'll appoint those to the court. And so that accounts for the outcomes, the study outcomes that we see in political science, which is justice votes align with presidential appointees. But that also accounts for why judges or justices report that they're not behaving politically. They have cogent political or legal theories that they're implementing. It just so happens that the different legal theories, jurisprudential theories, align with substantive political preferences.
You know, Donald Trump, as he's over the last 6 months, you've heard him talk about this idea that, you know, kind of bragging or promoting the idea that he appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, and that's made a huge difference. And you see the same thing, the opposite on the other side, you know, where the Democrats saying that that's the problem, is that we need to win the presidency because Donald Trump appointed to the Supreme Court. So both sides are trying to use the Supreme Court as a leverage in this election. Do you think that other than talk about it, does it swing votes?
Yeah, like I said, I think the data indicate that it can. Yeah. The question is how activated that is. Now, I mean, I'm talking beyond the data now, but I'll go. So there's certainly a lot of attention. I mean, there's always, like I said, since the 60s, there's been a fair amount of attention on the right, judging from, you know, the New York Times and the Washington Post and Biden and others' attention. The liberals are trying to activate the court as a voting issue, and I've at least heard reports that the Democrats are going to double down on trying to make the Supreme Court a voting issue for Democratic candidates in the fall in perhaps ways that they haven't done before.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is going to happen, and especially in the area of abortion. And they continue to point to the Dobbs decision, and how that the Republicans want to take away your rights. And so I think that that's going to be a big issue, or at least attempt to use that as an issue in the upcoming campaign, is that's the reason we need to reject Donald Trump, because they're the ones that took away your rights.
Yeah, well, the whole issue, particularly with respect to rights, is, we bandy the phrase liberal democracy, and oftentimes that phrase glosses over the tension between the two terms. By liberal, they're not talking about substantive outcomes, but usually sort of liberal in the classical sense, which is an attention to rights. And rights are trump cards that immunize those decisions from democratic or majoritarian control. Democracy, on the other hand, whether it reduces to mere majoritarianism or not, is popular opinion, is supposed to be affecting. So on liberal means you have this set of decisions that are sort of cabined off from majoritarian decision making. Democracy, on the other hand, means majority rules, and what the court has been doing for 200 years, in addition to Congress and the president and voters, is pricking the line of what decisions are subject to majoritarian control and which decisions do we take off the table. Before Roe versus Wade, abortion was one of those decisions that was subject to democratic deliberation and democratic decision making in the states. Roe v. Wade took the original abortion case in 1973, took it off the table. Some argued that in doing that, the court actually activated the anti-abortion movement that ultimately culminated in the Dobbs decision, which moved it back to democratic control in the states.
I looked up the numbers since Dobbs and legislation that has come out of the states. 25 states have kind of limited abortion in some way. 25 states have gone the other way or have done nothing. So it basically is legal in all areas. So which was really interesting because it is 25 and 25. It's an issue that's divides the country, and you can see where both groups will try to use it to their advantage in an electoral process.
Yeah, ironically, there was at least some of the scuttlebutt was by taking abortion and moving it back to the states, you'll depoliticize the issue because different states will be able to adopt different positions. It appears that was an incorrect hypothesis, that pushing it back to the states only made it even more political or politicized rather than less.
Right. And so, I think... So it's going to be interesting. So I took a look at what pollsters always ask a most important problem question. But when they ask a voter, what do you think the most important problem facing our country is today? And when they do that, like right now, currently, it's immigration, it's inflation, the economy, some jobs. And I looked for women's rights or abortion, and it's very low. Now, that doesn't mean it's not important. It doesn't mean it might not move a vote, but it seems like it's not a general phenomenon. It's very specific to certain voters.
Yeah, I think, on both sides, there's a dedicated cohort where abortion is at the top of the list. But again, the polling data, as you indicated, seemed to suggest that for most Americans, it's not a leading issue. My suspicion is that the Democrats, in trying to activate their supporters to vote on the basis of courts, will sort of go for an aggregation and say, not only is it the Dobbs decision, but there are these other, 6-3 decision that the court makes that are conservative and are rolling back gains that the Democrats made when in power for the last 2 generations, if not 3 or 4 generations. And so they'll try to sort of put a coalition together to invite their supporters to vote on the basis of the court rather than just policy.
So do you think that the voters see the courts as a balancing effect? So if they're, and if maybe you don't have control of the White House or maybe Congress, that we need the courts to balance that, or is that too much of a stretch for the average voter?
Yeah, I don't know if voters do. I know a lot of commentators do, and you can. It's oftentimes whose ox is being gored. Is if you're a Democratic loser, you're all of a sudden in favor of the courts and independent judicial action. If you're the Democratic winner, then of course the proper role for the judiciary is due deference to Democratic decision makers.
Right. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. I do think we're going to see a lot of talk about the courts coming up just because the numbers seem to, among Democrats, they're very upset about, and I think it goes back to probably primarily Dobbs and that decision. But thinking about that, this court has given a lot of opinions here recently, and some of them, they're high profile for a little while. Do you see any opinions that are really going to kind of really move numbers or matter?
I think most of the decisions this term are more technical issues, and even I think the biggest case. Sorry, I should define what I mean by that. The case that will affect most lives most of the time is probably not the case that most people will be able to discuss or note, which is the Raimondo case where the court overturned the so-called Chevron decision from a couple of decades ago. And that deals with administrative decisions made when Congress has enacted an ambiguous statute. Now, again, I mean, immediately your eyes start to glaze over when talking about that. But this is how every federal court looks at how every agency makes a decision under the congressional authorization. And as a result, this will affect thousands of decisions in different cases and affect whether or not who the president is and who appoints agency heads will have as much impact as they would have had if Chevron wasn't overturned. So aside from that, I mean, there are notable cases, but I don't think that there's nothing like Dobbs on that was recently decided this term.
I guess if you look at these different cases, let's take the Chevron decision, Raimondo. Can one party say that they're the winner or loser on that?
I mean, yes, although it's actually a little more bipartisan than the commentary would have on it. But nonetheless, the right has been at war with the administrative state since since the 1890s, since the 1930s, certainly, since the 1960s. The Federalist Society, which got cranked up, as I recall, in the late 1970s in law schools, has always had the administrative state in its scope of field, in its eyesight, and the Chevron decision basically said judges need to defer to agency interpretations of congressional statutes if there's any ambiguity. And so that was just a rule of thumb of automatic deference to what administrative agencies said the law was. Overturning Chevron now says that no, we as judges will exercise our traditional power. This is what the court said back in 1803 under Marbury versus Madison that announced judicial review, that it is unquestionably the role of the courts to say what the law is. And this is applied to administrative agencies as well as to Constitution versus laws and so forth. And so this is one step at the margin at least, that reins in administrative scope and reins in the power of the administrative state. Now, the thing is in the major questions doctrine that was announced a couple of years ago, some of the cases that the court drew on were examples of where administrative agencies had implemented conservative interpretations. And so, it does cut both ways. Is if an administrative agency provides a conservative interpretation to a statute, a judge conceivably looking at what Congress actually said, what they wrote in the statute, could say, no, that's not what's there, and so even though that's a permissible reading, that's not a reasonable reading, and throw out the conservative opinion. Nonetheless, most of the time, conservatives, and I think most of us anticipate that what administrative agencies do is taking actions rather than non-actions, and as a result, it enhances agency power. Now, the open question is whether this is the final step in the conservative majority on the court seeking to rein in the administrative state, or if there is a yet another further, even more significant step, which would be to overturn the so-called delegation doctrine, which would restrict Congress from delegating so much lawmaking authority to executive branch agencies. And this has been recognized, that is this ability of Congress to do this since the 1920s, but that's sort of the big fish here. Chevron, is large in the scope of things, but the question is whether this is not the ultimate step, but the penultimate step, and the delegation doctrine, which would severely restrict the ability of Congress to delegate so much authority to administrative agencies, will come up.
When it comes to some voters have said that this decision is going to hurt the environmental movement, because you had a lot of the environmental rules that came out of the administrative state, kind of the executive branch, and so by taking that away, they said, well, it's going to hurt the environment ultimately. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, and maybe that it's too complex for the average voter to be a political message in the campaign that this is what the courts have done. So do you think we'll see like more kind of symbolic talk as opposed to really detailed explanations?
As important as it is, I don't think that talking about Chevron is an electoral winner just because it's too complicated. Even, and again, because it's not all black and white. It's not all anti-liberal, pro-conservative, because some of these important cases were cases that came up under the Reagan administration where the EPA was refusing to take action, and people filed suit in order to re-implement earlier decisions, or to say that that's an unreasonable interpretation of the statute, and basically force more liberal action. Secondly, the thing is that this doesn't take it off the table. All Congress needs to do is write clear legislation, and they can implement anything that they want, and the court, and under the Raimondo even, courts will implement what Congress says they're going to do, and so it's not like it's completely off the table, where the federal government is now restricted from doing things that it could do.
So maybe we'll see a campaign strategy now is that I can write clear legislation.
Yeah, that's a bumper sticker.
Yeah, exactly. The decision that was made, you might help me with the language, about the drug, the morning after pill.
Right.
It seemed it was 9-0, and it seemed to go against those who are the pro-life side, which was very interesting. And I think you had mentioned to me earlier that this was a very technical decision, and there's probably more to follow. But which is interesting to me because Dobbs seemed to favor one side, and this seemed to favor the other side. And
well, this is one example where the popular commentary almost has no connection with what the court actually did. The decision has nothing to do with Dobbs or abortion rights. The decision, and this is why it's 9-0, was made on a technical issue of access to the courts called standing. And again, I'll try to explain what it is without your eyes glazing over too quickly. Americans often think of the court as being a body of philosopher kings, that the 9 justices sit there and sort of think about what what truth, justice, and the American way is, and implement those. The court has never thought of its role in that way ever since George Washington was president. The court has something called standing, or a standing doctrine, which means the Article 3, Section 2, the Article 3 deals with the courts in the U.S. Constitution, says that courts can only decide cases and controversies. The Supreme Court has always interpreted that, since they declined to give an advisory opinion to George Washington when he asked for their help in a treaty with France, a proposed treaty with France, that we don't make decisions in the abstract. The way that turns out is, in order to get standing, which means stand in front of a judge, in order to get inside a courtroom, you need to have the threat of being actually injured or damaged by the action. And what this does is just make sure that the person who gets in the court has something on the line, so that the judge or the judges are comfortable that when they make a decision, they've heard the best arguments by people motivated to make those arguments. This case, dealing with the abortion drug, was filed by a group of pro-life physicians, and what the court said is that this group of physicians isn't threatened themselves with any injury however the case is resolved. And so they didn't have standing to challenge the FDA's action or lack of action with respect to the way that this drug is being used. And so basically this doesn't mean that it won't be decided, but somebody who either lacks access or got access and because the drug arguably wasn't approved for these for the way that it was used. Somebody with something more on the line can file suit, and then courts can decide it. But that it was just too abstract of a question, and the group of physicians didn't have anything on the line. So basically, they said you don't get your day in court.
Interesting. Yeah, the 9-0 decision I think shocked a lot of people.
Yeah.
Do you see the courts weighing in regard to elections this anytime soon? What I mean by that is, states have all their after 2020, we saw a lot of state legislation kind of things change. What's permissible, what's not permissible, whether you can have drop-off boxes or not in each state. Do you see the courts intervening in any way, or is that remains to be seen?
Well, in the main, they've declined to intervene in a substantial way in the last election cycle. These are matters largely for state legislatures to take care of, and then state courts. There are certainly 14th Amendment issues that can be raised if states are focused on doing things that are against equal protection of the laws or due process or whatever. But for the most part, these are, what sort of ballots we use, mail-in, computer, etc., are state issues, and federal courts just don't have any role to play in those.
It was interesting when I was in Europe talking to not only political science colleagues but also elected officials. They all are just confused by the fact that we have really 50 elections in 50 states and no national elections.
Yeah, right.
And so the rules are different in everywhere, and that is something very unique to our federalist system.
Well, Europeans in particular, but even many Americans, when we talk about federalism, it's often treated as a synonym for decentralization. But there's lots of non-federal. France has a decentralized national system, but it's not federal. The national government can change that anytime that it wants. What confuses people, Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America called it a complicated system. Justice Kennedy talked about splitting the atom of sovereignty, and the quick and easy way to understand what sovereignty is who gets the last word. And despite 2 generations of people thinking that the national government has sucked up all the power in the country, states still have a lot of decisions in which they're sovereign, meaning they get the last word, and there is nothing that the federal government can do to change or overturn what states do. It is a complicated system, and particularly Europeans, because the idea of divided sovereignty is almost an oxymoron. Don't get that states can make decisions that even the president with Congress and the federal courts can't change.
Well, I think that's what makes thinking about campaigns, thinking about elections, so interesting as we move forward. Dr. Rogers, thank you so much for being with us today, and it's you've given us some insight. I think it's interesting to me as a former campaign consultant to look at, I've seen candidates use the courts to their favor, maybe work against somebody else. What's going to happen in this year? And it seems to me like some of these things are the average citizen doesn't know whether or not what to think about it. So we're going to see a lot of push in this area of who gets to nominate. Are they for you or against you? We're so a lot more symbolic type gestures in the campaign. So thank you so much for being with us today, and you've given us so much insight. Well, that's episode 7 of our Inside Political Science. Be sure to tell your friends and neighbors about the podcast. You can, and thank you, Dr. Rogers. And just want to say thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Inside Political Science is a production from KAMU, Aggieland's Public Television and Radio. For more information, visit tx.ag/Inside Political Science. Have a question for our experts? Email them at insidepolicy@tamu.edu. Also, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss a new episode.